Hi, in this video I'm going to paint a few bricks. This is the picture that I'm going to be working on, and here's a reference photo that you can screenshot and use it for your own purposes if you want to follow along. So in this painting I wanted to talk a little bit about construction. I think it's kind of fitting that I'm painting bricks and talking about construction. Anyway, there's different layers to painting, and even when you're painting alla prima like I'm doing here, it's still worth thinking about the different layers and different steps that go into making a compelling painting. So the very first sort of piece of the foundation is the drawing and the composition. So at the very beginning you want to find your composition. This one is a very simple composition, and I kind of like it that way. It's really just three rectangles within a square, and in combination they almost make up a square themselves. So it's kind of like a square within a square altogether. So if you were to paint this and put it off to the side, I think it might look a little weird. So I'm kind of just centering everything in the middle and being conscious of the amount of space I have on either side. So that's kind of the first part of it. I'm starting out with a little bit of mineral spirits to thin the paint. I'm using terpenoid, and just kind of a very light diluted wash of burnt umber, which is an earth tone, which means that it's made from things that come out of the dirt, and it's kind of fitting that you paint bricks with earth tones. So I think it's going to be most of my palette. It's going to be these browns and reds, and obviously I'll have to bring in those whites. And I'm erasing things a little bit here and there if I need to correct things just a little bit. And some people also, in this early stage, they'll take a ruler and they'll just block everything out exactly and then paint over that. Generally I'm not a big fan of the ruler. I like to use the edges of my painting as a guide. So sometimes I'll grab onto the edge of the board and then use that as my little rail to guide my paintbrush. But I generally don't use a ruler on a painting. So now that I have this dark color, I'm going to use this to fill in my darkest darks on this painting, and that's kind of the first step of building your painting after you sort of finished on the drawing, is to begin with your darks and then continue on from there towards your middle tones and then eventually to the lights. So I'm using basically just pure burnt umber for now, and I'll probably add in a little bit of reflected light in there later on, but for now that's good enough just to block in where my darks are. And then the next darkest color is going to be the actual bricks, and then they're pretty dark overall, much darker than the background, so I'm going to start with them. And the color of the front face of at least the top brick is it's kind of a reddish brown. So I'm using some burnt sienna, lightening it up just a little bit with some titanium white, bringing in some burnt umber back in. There was some already on my brush, and I'm gonna pull it a little bit more towards a cool red with some alizarin crimson. So that's gonna give me a kind of a base middle color of that front face. And there's not a lot going on in this painting, so it's really just, you know, those tones of browns and grays. So it pays to kind of spend some time mixing the colors and getting those colors just right. And I'm going to apologize ahead of time for my hand covering the painting from time to time. I'm not really paying attention to the video while I'm painting, so my focus is really just on the process itself and not the tutorial, so apologies for that. There are places within that front face that are a little bit cooler and a little bit darker, so I've brought in a little bit of ultramarine blue to kind of darken it off. And I'm not using any black here. I'm not a big fan of using black. I'd rather just make those colors myself. If you want a black, you can get burnt umber, and then add to it some ultramarine blue. If you want it even darker, you can add a little bit of alizarin crimson, and that'll make it almost pitch black. And also adding some chromium green here, which is kind of a nice earthy green also. I mean, it's made out of a metal, so it's not exactly earth color, but it is earthy and not very intense. So it's a good color to, if something feels too red, to pull it away from the reds and more towards a neutral color. And I guess I should have probably covered off on this, but you know, some of you may be asking, why would I want to paint bricks and not, you know, not something more colorful, something with a little bit more more saturation. And I think that, you know, I've done a couple of these paintings recently that have very subdued colors, and what I found is that when you reduce the amount of colors in your subject, you are kind of forced to see much more colors, to see much more subtleties and variations in color within those subjects. It's kind of like tuning your eye. So rather than having like a bright orange and bright green, bright blues, things like that, if you have to distinguish between two different types of brown and what makes them different, how to mix the colors to achieve those colors, it's kind of a training exercise for the eyes. And the other reason I think is that I kind of wanted to add a little bit of an abstract quality to this painting. It's almost like the Rothko paintings that are just strips of color, and the focus becomes just on the relationships between the foreground color and the background colors, or the relationships between the two different colors that he has in the painting. I really loved his work, and wasn't necessarily inspired by it, but I thought this was kind of a nice little homage to his work. And I don't really do abstract paintings. I always like to have a subject, something to kind of go off of. So a way for me to bring abstract qualities into my painting is with the subject itself. And so that's kind of what I did there. So I was beginning to realize that it's hard to judge the tonal values, or how dark the bricks have to be, without having a background color in place. So mixing up a kind of a gray tone to to fill in the background and give myself a little bit of a point of reference, because with the white there, everything just feels so dark, and it's almost blinding, and your eyes are can't adjust enough to be able to see just the color of the brick. So it's nice to have a a little layer of paint all over your painting in order to be able to gauge things. And if you squint and look at the reference image, you can kind of tell that overall the color of the background, that back wall, I mean, not the color, but the tonal value of the back wall and the tonal value of the bricks is very similar. There's a little bit of a hot spot on top and to the right of the bricks, where the brick becomes a little bit darker versus the background. And then obviously there's a strip of light that's falling on top of the bricks. But overall, tonally, it's a very kind of very homogeneous composition. So that gray that I'm putting in is very similar to the brown tonally. I think that adds kind of another nice little subtlety to the painting. And then when you go over to the right side, things become a little bit lighter, so I'm adding a little bit more white, and also a little bit cooler actually too. So I'm adding a little bit of white and a little bit more ultramarine blue to the mix to make that lighter color. And this is actually a kind of a neat little trick, that if you make the background of your subject a little bit lighter on the shadow side of your subject, and a little bit darker on the lighter side, it creates kind of automatically creates a sense of space. You can't make it too blunt, and you can't make that difference too big, because then it'll look like you just sort of have completely different values going on in the background. But a little subtle change can really create a sense of depth and dimension. So next I'm going to paint in the surface of the table that it's what it's sitting on, and that tone is a lot lighter, so I'm using much more titanium white in the mix. And by the way, from here on out, I'm only using linseed oil to dilute the paint. I'm not really using the mineral spirits anymore. And sometimes you have to put put a little brush stroke on your painting to see if the color or the tonal values are right. In this case, the first time I put it down, it felt a little dark, a little too similar to the background color. And this is probably still a little bit too dark, but it's a good starting point. I'm going to push the lights out a little bit later and then push the darks a little bit further. But to begin with, you want to have kind of a little bit less contrast, and then you can build it up from there. So I think this is kind of where the ruler might have come in handy, because I think my horizon line is off. The other thing that's happening there is that on the left side of the bricks, the horizon line is lining up with the crack between the first and second brick on the bottom, and that's creating a little bit of tension there. So I'm going to want to move that horizon line a little bit up, just so it doesn't line up with that crack so much. Generally, you want to have things kind of intersect and not really line up perfectly. Otherwise, there's a little bit too much kind of discomfort sort of in those areas. The eye is kind of drawn to that and it doesn't feel right. So I'm just going to use the bottom of this board and kind of see, okay, definitely on the right side it's higher up than on the left side, so I want to bring that up a little bit. And that immediately feels better, and actually feels like there's a little bit more depth there right now. So technically I could have painted in the kind of a base coat on the bricks first, because they are a little bit darker than the background. But I just felt like I couldn't really gauge those colors well enough. And really the bricks are the important part here, and then the background is just sort of a supporting character. So I want to give myself the best opportunity to see colors and see what they look like in relationship to the background. And so I'm adding a little bit of more darks here, and now it feels like that shadow color is definitely not dark enough. And you can kind of see that as soon as I make that shadow color darker than the background color, there immediately begins to feel like a little sense of depth back there. It's kind of interesting how that works, especially with that top brick. And I know my reference photo was of bricks kind of straight on, but I think once I set them up and I kind of settled in front of my easel, the angle shifted just a little bit, and so now I'm seeing the side of the bricks, and I think it's actually kind of helping the composition to give it a little sense of depth. Even though my goals were to try to be a little bit more abstract, I'm still kind of drawn to the illusion of depth in paintings, and the illusion of things feeling real and dimensional. So even in this kind of very flat, mostly textural kind of painting, I'm still drawn to that. So now this is where we begin to kind of see the different varieties of browns that live in these bricks, and each one of these bricks looks different. I mean, they might have been the same color when they were first born, when they first came out of the kiln, but as they sat outside in my backyard and collected dirt and got bleached out by the sun and exposed to the elements, they did so in different ways, and so each one of them is slightly different. And I'm going to try to pick up on those differences and communicate them with paint. So now I'm mixing up a little bit of lighter color, and this is going to be for the very top of the brick, where the light catches it the most. That area right now is kind of very chromatic. There's a lot of red from my initial wash, and so I want to kind of bring it down a little bit, both tonally and chromatically. So it's kind of a gray color, but once it is applied and is surrounded by those other colors, like the front face of the brick and also the background color, it does feel quite right. Now there's other things going on in the picture. For example, there's the little dark edge along the front. There's also these chips where we see sort of the true color of the brick, that kind of really bright red brick red color. But this will serve as a decent kind of starting point for that area. And that color is also repeated at the top edge of every other brick, where the light catches it just a little bit before it recedes into the crack between the bricks. So I know I wanted to talk about sort of construction of a painting, and I think that once you're on the job site and you have to get things done, sometimes you do break the rules a little bit. So in this case, I think the sort of the true construction way of doing it would be to finish all the faces of the bricks and fill all those in before moving on to any of the lighter colors. But you know, sometimes you have to break the rules a little bit. Sometimes you forget a tape measure and you have to just eyeball it. Anyway, so now that I have these little bright spots, they actually help me. They also help me to determine how dark the faces of the bricks are going to be as well. So there's a method to everything, or a reason for everything. So I mentioned the bricks are different. So the top two are kind of similar actually, although the very top one is a little bit more red, and the bottom one has this light spot at the bottom, and I think this is where the sun kind of had a chance to bleach it out a little bit more than the other ones. So that's probably going to be one of the lightest parts of the front face. So I'm putting that in first, just because I had kind of a light color on the brush already, and I'm not really washing my brush or cleaning it up in any way between the colors, just because a lot of these colors are very similar. I just have to make sure that when I do mix the colors, I put out, or sort of I mix up enough of them that I get enough into my brush to load it up and make that a completely new color. And as I'm going, putting out some more paints that I kind of ran out of, so I just added a little bit more alizarin crimson and some cadmium red. And this is my base color for the bricks. It's both, it's sort of like the dark medium color for all three of the bricks. Again, I'm taking my time, and if I've added a little too much red, bring it down with a little bit of green, and if I go overboard with the green, I'm kind of bringing it back up, trying to get a good beginning color, because that's sort of my foundation for that surface, and I want it to be pretty close to where I want it to be, so that when I, in construction there's this saying, measure twice, cut once. Kind of similar deal here is that you want to kind of take your time with the initial layer, and then you're gonna sort of set yourself up for success. So I'm adding some of this kind of more red color into the top brick, and that same color is going to be used in the second brick as well, maybe with some slight variations. And hopefully you can see the difference between the color that I'm putting on and what was on there, and beginning to see the differences, the kind of the subtle changes between the colors, which is kind of the interesting part of this painting. Now there are a couple of spots around the edges that kind of bother me as I'm going down this path, and there's a few places where white is still showing through, and it's kind of breaking the illusion of depth and kind of getting in the way. So I'm gonna just quickly, as I'm doing this, do a couple of little touch-ups here and there. And I think it's okay to kind of bounce around the painting. Unlike in construction where you want to be focused on a single job, single task, and finish it right, I think in painting you can be allowed to notice something and then take care of it right away, because sometimes you'll forget. Sometimes you'll you might get distracted and go down a path and not see it again. So if you see something that bothers you in the painting, by all means, make those corrections, make those adjustments. Alright, so let's finally get to that middle brick. I'm adjusting the color a little bit from what I used on the top to make it a little bit warmer, a little bit more yellow, but still very similar. And for now I'm just filling in the white, just so I have a good base and a point of reference from which I can make further adjustments later on. And in this initial phase, as we're putting down kind of that initial layer, it's good to not go too thick with the paint, because when we come back to add details or add textures in certain areas, you want to have a surface that will accept more paint. And if you go and not fight with the new layer that you're adding on too much, and if you go too thick to begin with, then you just wind up battling with the previous layer. So I want to have enough, I want to have good coverage, but thinking ahead of time, or thinking ahead to when I'm going to be working back into that layer with additional layers. And the same goes for the amount of linseed oil that I'm using in the paint. Typically, if you're using linseed oil as a medium, it'll not get tacky, it'll not get more sticky as you paint, at least within that one session, unlike some other mediums. So you want to keep the amount of linseed oil down to a minimum, just enough so that it'll stick to the paint, it'll have enough flow. But if you wind up using too much linseed oil to begin with, then you'll have a little bit of trouble with additional layers on top of that. Generally, the more liquidy the paint and the more diluted it is with the linseed oil, the easier it'll go on top of another layer of paint without necessarily mixing with the previous layer too much. So then this final brick at the bottom is probably the most interesting one. It has it's the most different from the other ones, and it has a little bit more kind of weathering and sun scorching. It's a little bit lighter overall, and I think it's got a little bit more of an intense brick color in the middle part. So I'm gonna go ahead and mix that up, and it's the colors that I'm using are all the same, it's just different proportions. I am adding a little bit of cad yellow into this one as well too, just to bring up that intensity just a little bit. And as I've mentioned before, sometimes you just need to put a little swipe on the painting to see how it compares to everything else that's there, because sometimes the color that's on your palette is not going to be the same once you put it on the surface of your painting. So it's not a bad idea to test it out, and also you can also just mix things right on your painting by adding different colors into your mix and just going over what you already have there. And you can see how the brush, when I'm putting down the paint, at first it was giving those kind of white marks. It wasn't giving me very good coverage, and so by adding a little bit of linseed oil to that mixture, I'm able to make it flow much better. And then this brick has a little bit of a dark spot towards the top and also towards the bottom. And at the bottom there's kind of a combination of something that feels darker, or I guess less saturated at the base, and then there's some sun bleaching on top of that. So it's kind of a more like a lighter color than the middle of the brick, but a less intense hue than the middle of the brick. So I'm adding some of that darker color to begin with, and then I'm gonna go over that with a little bit of a lighter color that's less intense to indicate some of that sun scorching and some sun bleaching that happened in that area. So this initial layer of paint that I'm applying, I mean, it's taking me a little bit longer than maybe I would have liked, and you can certainly go much faster in this first layer. If you're really thinking about this in terms of constructing a painting, this initial layer could be much faster. I mean, it took me about half an hour to get here. But really, if you don't consider too much the variations in colors and things like that, you can go much faster, and then get to that level where everything is covered in paint, and then begin your refinements and a little bit more blocking in of things. In this case, I chose to go a little bit more meticulous and a little bit more slow, and it just sort of depends on how you feel at the time. What you can do is start off even with, rather than starting off with this kind of full power paint, you can dilute the paint quite heavily with mineral spirits, and then just do a very quick wash, almost like a watercolor, in which case you'll have something on the canvas already, and then you can begin sort of applying those thicker layers of paint and slowly building up the surface. But I think this way is kind of almost a little simpler and a little bit easier to understand the different steps to a painting. And again, I apologize for a video of just my hand in front of the camera. I know that's not very interesting. So hopefully you can forgive me for that. So now that we have basically paint all over the panel, all over this painting, that sort of completes one stage of the painting. In this case, I think you can equate it to having the foundation poured. We have our walls up. We have all the framing is done. We have, plumbing and electrical. Everything inside the walls is ready. And what's left is the kind of the trim, the finishing touches. And if you ever worked on on remodel or a construction of a house, you know that those small things could wind up costing you almost as much as the construction of the house itself. So there's no reason to underestimate the value of the refinements and the details that you do after this stage. And really, you can continue pushing those refinements way further than what I've done in this painting. It all depends on where your goals are for a particular piece. In this case, I was happy with a certain level, and I decided to stop there. You may have different goals, and you may want to continue adding more refinements and details, maybe even letting the painting dry and applying glazing over the initial layers of paint to add even more depth. It's really all up to you. But I think that what's important to note is that it's good to have a good foundation, because no amount of details over a crappy foundation are going to make a good painting. So spend the time to have a good composition, have a good drawing, and a good initial coverage of paint that is close to what you are going for. And spend some time in those loose areas where you can afford to erase things, you can afford to make mistakes, and don't rush into the details until you're happy with the overall construction of your painting. So now I think it's a good idea to take a closer look at the reference. And really, a lot of time in painting is spent looking. It's better to look more closely and apply less strokes on the painting than to kind of go hog wild and make inaccurate or inconsistent strokes. So take a close look at the details. There are, if you look at the bricks overall, yeah, they're brown, sure, but there's so much variation within those browns, within those different surface areas. For example, towards this bottom left corner of the top brick, things get a lot darker, but they also get less saturated. So that's what I'm working on right now. And as you go up a little bit, there's that dark area extends up and around the brick with a lot less saturation. But then there's chips, and there are different chips that come off the brick, ones that were chipped off much earlier in its life, which have had a chance to weather, and other chips that reveal more of that raw red brick color. And they're all different, and there are different variations like that throughout the brick. There's also texture, and there's different ways of handling texture in painting. You can just squint and approximate the overall color of the texture and just paint that. You can also try to replicate the texture with the texture of the paint. And in this case, this panel is very smooth, so it's not very easy to create texture aside from applying very thick brush strokes. But if this was a canvas, for example, what I could do is apply a darker color for where the texture is going to be, and then use the lighter color and just scumble it in a very kind of loose way, just barely grazing the surface of the canvas to let the little bumps in the canvas pick up those colors. In this case, I think I'm going to go for more of a abstracted version of texture and just use the squint method. Just squint and try to pick up the overall color of those areas, and not to worry so much about the rough texture itself. Just try to get that across with color only. And sometimes as you're painting, you might introduce a color that is not exactly right to your reference, and sometimes that's okay. Sometimes you may do that and actually like what happens on the canvas or on the palette, and decide to keep those things. Or you may want to go in and address them. It kind of depends on how things are feeling. So for example, on that bottom brick, that very bright orange kind of stripe down the middle is not quite right. It's not quite consistent to what is happening in the real brick. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust that. But I could actually keep that if I like that look. But in this case, I wanted to stay a little bit closer to reality and go ahead and make those adjustments. But you can see how in this stage you have to do a lot more observation and a lot more subtle variations within the paint, because it's sort of everything is brown, but you have to work within those browns to find the right colors. Oh, I think my power went out for a little while, so I had to cut out a piece of the video. Sometimes when you're on a job site, you don't always have good electrical connections, so you have to work around your power problems. Anyway, everything's back now and we can continue. So I've been working on this bottom brick for a while, and there is a danger to spending too much time in one certain area. There's a danger of overworking an area. This is where you go back and forth so many times that the paint becomes kind of muddy and not interesting, and it loses a lot of the freshness that you had when you first applied it. So it is a danger, but I think that it's more valuable to experience sort of the moment of having gone too far or having overworked something. I think there's value in that too, so that you can know in the future where to stop. Realistically, there's nothing that you can do to train yourself to stop in time. The only thing you can do is just experience it enough times to get a sense of, okay, this looks good, I probably don't want to work on it anymore. But having painted many, many years, I still find myself learning that lesson quite often. So it's not something that is easily picked up. But anyway, let's watch me struggle with this area, which probably should have been left alone about 5 minutes ago. So as we get to the little chips in the bricks, the color becomes much more saturated and much more red. So I'm introducing some more cadmium red and applying that color in those areas. So this little corner on the right, it's kind of an interesting spot because it's in shadow, but it is more intense, so it's kind of darker but more intense at the same time. And once we get to the chips that are hit by the light directly, then those become really, really bright and almost orange in color. So here I'm barely using any of the darker color, but mostly it's cadmium red, titanium white, and cadmium yellow and orange. And that might be a little bit too bright to begin with, but it's nice to start off a little bit brighter and then bring things down, because things like reds and oranges and yellows, they're very easy to mud up. So sometimes it helps to begin a little bit brighter than what's actually there and just kind of mud it up on the painting as needed. The other thing is that there's a way to make those things feel much more integrated by how you treat the edges and by adding some little shadows within those colors as well. And because I'm going over paint that's already there, I want to make sure of two things. A, that I have enough paint on my brush when I'm going over those areas, but also that the paint is diluted enough that it'll easily stick to those areas without mixing in with the color underneath. To a degree, the brush that you use also matters. So I'm using a bristle brush, which tends to release the paint a little bit easier than a synthetic brush, which has a little bit more stiffness or a little bit more density to it and tends to pick up the colors underneath a little bit more. And within this crack, this little part that got chipped off, there are variations of color. So there are little peaks and valleys and light and shadow. So I'm mixing up a brighter color that's going to be for those areas that are hit more directly with the light, and that'll create a little bit of dimension within that area and really make it look like there's little chips and pieces of brick that have come off there. And that bright color is also going to go along the edge of the crack and help identify that little piece of light that hits right along the edge there. And now that I have those two colors mixed, I can kind of work between them to find the right colors. So you see, like right now my brush doesn't quite have enough paint on it, and so it's mixing in with the darker color more, which you can use to your advantage also. If you want to just add a little bit of brightness without changing the color completely, you can use a brush that has a little bit less paint on it, less loaded up with paint, and just allow that paint to mix in with the color that's already there. So I'm applying these little chips all over the bricks wherever I can see them, and one thing that I find interesting is that the color itself, if you look on the palette, is not that bright. It's not that intense or saturated. You know, you could think of it as almost like another brown color. But compared to the rest of the colors on the painting, they really shine and they really create a lot of interest in every single area where I put them. And that's because everything else is so subdued and so subtle and desaturated that these little pops of color really shine. And you know, I can compare this to when I'm painting something like a still life. Let's say if I have a still life with some oranges, or like clementines and some green leaves. In that case, sometimes I might be using almost pure cadmium orange color, and it still might not look bright enough because everything else on the painting is bright. So by sort of creating the environment that you're creating a certain environment within a painting, you allowed colors to be brighter or less bright in relationship to everything else. So I just kind of find it interesting that this really subdued color can have so much brightness and so much saturation just based on its surrounding colors. So once I have all the big chips in place, then I have to kind of go around and choose what other smaller details I'm going to put in. And I have to be kind of judicious because it's easy to kind of go down this rabbit hole of putting in, trying to capture every detail that's there, and that's not really necessary. You know, once in a while it's good to squint, and when it comes to the details, you squint a little bit less and see what you're still seeing and what's missing in your painting, and just try to get those things in. Like these marks that I've made right now, they're not quite right. Like some of them are a little too bright, so I'm going to use some of my base paint to go ahead and sort of push them down just a little bit so they don't look like they just stuck onto the surface of the painting. Alright, I'm gonna just paint for a little while and I'll come back when we get to some more interesting parts. So now it's time to work a little bit on the surface that the bricks are sitting on, and when I initially blocked in that color, I made it a little bit darker than it actually is, especially towards the left side of the bricks. This is the side that is closest to the light, and here there's a definite hot spot where the light is much brighter, and it sort of slowly falls off as you go further away from that area. So by bringing that in, I'm kind of also creating a little bit more focus in that area, and at the same time creating a little bit more depth. So things that are a little bit brighter are closer to me, and as they go further away, the light falls off and becomes a little bit darker. And at the same time, I'm taking this opportunity to fill in any little gaps that I might have missed, where there's still a little bit of white showing through from my gessoed panel. And then behind the bricks on the right side, I'm bringing that up a little bit as well, just to reinforce a little bit more of that depth that's happening back there. And I think we're getting pretty close to being done. I would say that if we're gonna stick with the construction analogy, we're doing the final coat of paint before we sweep up the job site and open it up to the owner. And speaking of which, this painting has already been sold, so in case you were wondering, you can't have it. I do have another painting of bricks that is available though. So if you really like bricks, there's one out there for you. So anyway, I think I'm gonna wrap things up and just kind of let this play out. As always, thanks for watching. If you've made it this far, I commend you. You've watched a painting of bricks being created. So that's not for everybody's level of patience. So if you've made it this far, congratulations. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you've learned something. And I don't know, let me know what you think of my analogies. Let me know what you think of this painting, how it came out, and just any other thoughts. If you haven't subscribed already, please do so. And if you like this channel and you like the content here and you think somebody else might like it too, I'd really appreciate you sharing with your friends.